Well, welcome to Module 2, and we're going to talk about the brain's 7 superpowers. And all of this really has to do with how you switch states. So we mentioned this in the last module, but we'd like you to right now name the state you're in right now. What would you call it? And then, what state would you like to be in? And the question is, how do we stay longer in the states we want to be in? Well, a lot of times we have to bridge ourselves into what we call the target state. That's our ideal state. Sometimes you can't go from being very, very upset to very, very calm without calming down and kind of easing yourself into calm. And you do this all the time. People that get stuck in a state forget, maybe they have amnesia, for how to kind of calm that down and then bridge themselves slowly into the target state.
So the cerebral cortex and the limbic system operate together. And as we mentioned before in the last module, when we talked about the monks, part of the brain, the limbic system, we got three-tiered brain. One is the cerebral cortex. That's the part that processes information and we use for thinking, logic, so on and so forth. And that's the newest kid on the block, if you will. The second part of the brain is the limbic system, which is the midbrain. That has to do with emotions. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And we have the brainstem, which has to do with neurological functioning at an autonomic level. So in the part of the brain, we talked about the amygdala, which is almond size, almond shape, part of the limbic system. And again, the amygdala runs a lot of emotions. So when there's a lot of activity in the amygdala, metabolic activity, electrical activity, then what happens is the right prefrontal cortex tends to light up. And when the right prefrontal cortex lights up, we become aware of danger. That's our NORAD, if you will. And part of the problem is if we are more anxious, we can habitually get into a cycle where the amygdala stays over-aroused. And if the amygdala stays over-aroused, then the right prefrontal cortex stays very activated, and people walk around in a state of stress, in a state of hypervigilance.
So we have different attentional styles. This is important because it has to do with the quality of our attention. The quality of our attention has everything to do with how we feel and how flexible we are to move into an emotional state and out of it when we want to. So this also reflects our resilience to external stresses. So if you consider your client's attentional style, the person's attentional style is related to particular issues the person has. For example, do you have clients that they cannot get off of an idea and they just keep going over and over and over it? Bill's going to tell you a story about that in a little while. Or do you have some people that can't get from sadness to joy, and as you listen to them talk, the statements, internal statements they make to themselves are all pretty negative and sad. And I had a therapist come to me one time that said he was in analysis, and he'd been in analysis for 3 years. And he said, yes, I think it's really helping me. He said that I seem to be really depressed all the time. And I said, well, what are you working on? And he started to recount all the really bad things that he experienced in his family. And I said, so how often have you been evaluating and going over what happened to you? He said, well, for about 3 years. And that is certainly one approach. Our idea is, while the story's important, we want to retrain our attention not to linger in negativity, because we don't want to particularly go on an archaeological dig of all the horrible things or every little bad thing that happened to us, because then we start to practice negative feeling.
Right. In fact, we'll talk later about post-traumatic stress. But one thing that can happen when people have been traumatized is they're encouraged and sometimes demanded to talk about that too much, before they have an opportunity to put that into long-term memory. With teams that come in and help people deal with trauma, if they get them to talk just enough to reconnect. Sometimes when people have been traumatized, they feel disconnected with the rest of the world. The team that comes in can help them reconnect by talking a little bit about the trauma. But if they're expected to talk too much, and what happens is that trauma does not go into long-term memory, and it stays in short-term memory, and they're more likely to be triggered. Well, same thing with childhood experiences. Sometimes it is important to talk about what happened to you if it was traumatic, but people can get into more and more and more fine-tuned detail and end up recalling painful experiences that end up in practice that state of misery.
That's right, exactly. Well, so we'd like you to look at your PowerPoint. We've given you this picture of an automobile. Let me just describe it. This is a brand new Lexus automobile that has been driven into a road of wet cement. Well, I really hate this. The person behind the wheel is a woman. It's so, really sexist to recall that. But, and so this was all over the news in Houston, and this poor woman didn't see the men. You might notice the men in back of the car in bright yellow vests, all were waving at her and trying to keep her from driving into the cement. And of course, it turns out she was on her cell phone. This is a problem with attention, right? And what we know is you can't do two things at one time. There's really no such thing as multitasking because you're focused on one thing and then you have to shift and focus on another. It's impossible to focus on two things at the same time. Later, we're going to talk about how this is a really good thing, but in this instance, this was a very difficult situation because it's really difficult to get cement off of your car, and I don't know if that car was able to get through.
Or get the car out of the cement.
Right. She was on the news and she said she was in her car calling her husband saying, "Hi, sweetheart, you'll never guess what just happened to me." And then we didn't hear the rest of that story. But there you are. So also we wanted to talk to you about that we have motivational drivers that influence our mental states, influence our behaviors. One of them is we have a need for security. So that is, we have a need for order. And, in a time like we're experiencing, where we're under a pandemic, that sense of order seems to disappear. We need to feel almost invulnerable. People wouldn't get into a car and drive if they didn't have that feeling of being invulnerable.
And doing things the same way over and over and over, because people's routines have been up and having children home that usually would be in school or not being able to go out to a movie or to a restaurant or even to a gym. People's routines have been very much upended, and that takes away a sense of security. At the same time, we have a need for change, and those two needs sometimes end up in conflict with one another.
Or another word for that would be a need for novelty.
Novelty.
Yeah, and so sometimes in families, one person has a really high need for order and the other person has a high need for novelty. And one person might want to go to the same restaurant all the time, the other person wants to go to different places all the time. So you have to kind of work that out. But in addition, we have a need for growth. We need to be feeling like we're learning new things all the time. And we have a need for contribution. And at the same time, we have a need to feel important, like what our contribution is making is important and means something. And then we also have a high need for community. So all of these can be important drivers, and it's important, I think, when you're doing an assessment of your client to kind of find out what are the major motivation drivers that this person experiences, because that will tell you where their motivation is for change, making change. Well, we'd like to give you one key to change that we call a brain shift. And this is just kind of a protocol that we developed in brain change therapy. So the first thing is the changing your state.
And then to condition the
That's
new
right.
state.
Condition the new state. And how do you condition a new state? You go over it and over it in your mind. And by the way, you're doing that all the time, even though you may not notice that that's what you're doing.
And then we want to define problems as having many solutions.
Absolutely. Because they do. I'm reminded of, if we could tell a story about Milton Erickson, even though this is not a course on
Right.
hypnosis, who had his students in Phoenix, and he would say to them, how many ways can you go from Phoenix to Tucson and back again? And they would, start with the normal ways. You could take a car, you can take the train, you could take a bus, and they'd run out of ideas, and he would say, well, that's all very good, but if you relax your mind, you're going to come up with a variety of other solutions. And so they would kind of feel relaxed a little bit, and then popping into their minds were other ideas about what they could do. Maybe they could take a hot air balloon, or take an airplane around the planet. All those are kind of silly.
And the ability to play, what Erickson would do in practicing playing, because one of the things that shut down solution generation is no. The word no. If you can play, if you work in teams, when you want people to come up with novel solutions, to make a game of it, to play, it's in those moments where people are doing things that seem silly, fanciful, and often new solutions, profound solutions, can be found.
That's exactly right. So the idea here is that there are many, many solutions to a problem, and your mind will go on a search for it after you've already been thinking about it. And the next step is to create powerful alternatives. So we always think if you have a plan to accomplish a goal, it's always useful to have plan B and C, or to think about, or to have the flexibility if your plan A begins to have some obstacles and you can't figure those out, then what else can you do to get to the goal? And then, go ahead.
Finally, to take action.
Absolutely. And taking action is so important. Some people can imagine a difference in their lives, but they're kind of blocked internally to taking the step of action.
And often the blockage to taking action is the fear of criticism, the fear of it's not going to work. And the most successful entrepreneurs, the most successful problem solvers are those people who take what a lot of people call failure. This is just something that didn't work. Thomas Edison was asked how many times I tried to create a light bulb. He said he could tell you, and he gave us a large number of ways that it didn't work. They were just simply steps to finding a way that the incandescent light bulb actually works. So Edison and other inventors were not afraid of not finding the right answer right away. These were just steps that would lead their thinking to become more precise and actually help them find the solution.
That's right. And so this is just a process we're suggesting to you that as a therapist, you can find out what is the problem state the person's in, what's the target state that they would like to get in, help them inhibit the state, that is, as you talk about it, people, become an observer for themselves rather than being in the midst of the problem. And every time they observe it and they talk about it from the outside, they're deconditioning the circuit or state. And then we're going to show you how to do this in just a little bit. You can turn on a new circuit, you're lowering arousal, and then you're going to be able to get a target state and condition that state by going over that. It's not as complicated as it sounds. If you think about wanting to, learn how to drive a car, if you remember what it was like when you first sat inside a car, you were scared, You knew you wanted to do it, but what did you call upon? You called upon your ability to take a risk.
Right.
You called upon, I guess, your confidence in your instructor.
Right.
And you had in your mind where you were going, so that was your goal end. And as you began to take a little risk and you learned, the different aspects of driving the car, and you got more and more familiar with it, then you developed a new state of mind when you'd sit behind the wheel. And that's what happens in our learning. And so every time you had that new state and you practiced the state, you got more and more confident driving. So here's just an idea. We talked about how it's really difficult to go from one problem state, in this case to a target state, with one fell swoop. Most people cannot make that shift, so we have to find an intermediate state. So what would that be? So how would we do that? And what's the significance of that? So if people are really anxious, and let's say they're 1 to 10 on subjective units of disturbance as a scale, and they're a 10 in anxiety, rather than asking them to go to calm, which would be a target state, you might say, what would it be like for you? What would you have to do to come down to a 9? Now, most people can figure that out right away. So in this case, the 9 would be your intermediate state. Our target state wouldn't be 8, but you would help them begin to kind of walk themselves. What could you do to become an 8 and a 7 and so forth? And a lot of people know how to do that. And we're going to give you other tools in this course, so people are not just trying to do it cognitively, that will help that. So that's called chaining states. There are many techniques for us to get the brain to release some of these wonderful neurochemicals, like you were talking about oxytocin early on.
So nurturing touch will lead to a release of oxytocin. Soothing music is something else that will lead to a release of oxytocin. Dietary fat, olive oil, is something, again, if you take olive oil in, then the brain is likely to release oxytocin. Hugging a pet, so your cat, your dog, animal that comes and cuddles with you, you're releasing oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical.
Right. And then also when you feel trusted by your partner or somebody else, when you receive psychological support, warmth, and empathy. So oxytocin actually suppresses the amygdala that stimulates fear and anxiety, and that's partly why it's so important.
So, we're going to talk a story that you probably all have heard. Chesley Sullenberger was a pilot that found himself in a situation that he had never been in before, with both engines of the plane, after they'd taken off just a few minutes, because birds flew into the engine. They had birds fly into engines before, and never had taken out both engines at one time. Now, he landed the plane in the Hudson River. But we'll go back for just a moment. And Sullenberger was asked, how did you keep from being afraid? Sullenberger said, I was very afraid. What did you do? He says, all pilots are taught to practice deliberate calm. Because when you're flying a plane, you don't want to be freaking out. You want to have a list of things that you need to do, protocols to follow, secondary protocols, all those things need to be practiced. Because you learn how to fly in a state of calm, you need to develop an intentional calm. So what Sullenberger did when he was talking to ground control at different airports, he'd taken off from LaGuardia, they kept telling him, no, you can turn back, and Sullenberger said, no, I'm not going to make it. He was calm enough to realize he didn't have the time to do that. So, the first part of the story is that Sullenberger took and made a perfect landing in the Hudson River. And you see on this slide how the people will line up on the wings when you have to make a water landing in an airplane, you exit the wings, not the back and not the front. And so everybody on that plane was 158 people, I think, including the crew, got to safety without any problem. There was a second time the Sullenberger actually practiced deliberate calm when the NTSA, National Transportation Safety Authority, interviewed and questioned Sullenberger and his co-pilot. They kept telling him that all of the simulations said that he could have turned back. And they were angry with Sullenberger because he didn't do that, did not take the advice of ground control, that he took an airplane and landed in the Hudson River, so that airplane was not going to be usable again. Sullenberger realized something. And again, it was a state of calm that they had never practiced using both engines at one time, regardless of how they would be lost. And they had to make decisions that they had never ever trained for. And he said, you've got to factor in a certain amount of time. So they took 13 seconds. It cost about 13 seconds before they decided what they needed to do. And when they factored in that extra 13 seconds, none of the simulations, when they tried to get back to any of the airports that they were trying to get them to land, they would have landed somewhere in New York City and crashed the airplane, all its passengers, and who knows how many people on the ground and in the buildings would have died too. So the ability to practice deliberate calm enabled him to think about what he needed to do, know that the people who were telling him to go back were wrong, and then he was being questioned that they didn't realize they had to add extra time in. They had tried the simulations as, oh, we've got both engines off, now we turn back. That wasn't going to happen. And so twice he did that, able to save himself, crew, all the passengers, as well as his own career when he was being questioned.
And so we all have the capacity to train our minds in deliberate calm. One of the ways to do that is to think about a time when you were really calm and get that back in your mind, or go out in nature and you can do a variety of things, be around water. But when you practice that, the more you practice it, the more easily that mental state is able to come up. And again, we mentioned this the last module, this biofeedback principle. When you control your physiology, you have power over your mind, and your attention controls the systems in the body, by the way, from temperature to heart rate to brain frequency ratios. And all of that is within your control. It just takes a little practice.
And when we did the exercise of warming the hands,
Right.
and I was talking about fireplaces and sunny days, your attention was just listen to me talk and give these images to you that you played with and just paid attention to, and you changed what was going on in your body temperature.
That's right.
So we have 7 emotional circles, and we talk about this in our book, Brain Change Therapy. We talked with neuroscientist Dr. Panksepp, who now has passed away, but in doing animal studies, he found that all mammals share 7 emotional circuits, from humans to little mice. One is rage or anger. And by the way, none of these are wrong. We have a time and place for all of these emotional circuits. So rage or anger is one of them. Fear or anxiety is another one. Panic, grief or stress is a third. Care or nurture is another emotional circuit. Play, in fact, all animals like to play. They like to laugh. In fact, that concept would tickle the little tummies of mice, and they actually would laugh. Lust or sexual arousal, and then seeking or curiosity. And each of these neural circuits play an important role in our lives.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And so we can construct what we call a neuro bridge to a new belief. One of the things that holds people back is our limiting beliefs, but through new experiences. And these new experiences, let's just suggest this to you. By the way, Many people have said to us that this particular piece of information is worth the cost of the seminar.
Yes.
What we call neuro-repatterning, and that is, this is really helpful to teach clients about this. They know it intuitively, but not cognitively. First of all, curiosity calms fear. So if your client's talking about some problem, and usually there's a fear component in there somewhere, you say to the person, what is it about this problem that is giving you this particular emotion? And what happens to the client? The client must step out of themselves, so to speak, become an observer of their mind and be curious. And remember, you can't have two different feelings at the same time. So if you're curious, you can't feel fearful. And if you're curious, you're going to explore. So curiosity calms fear. Humor changes anger if it's done, if the timing is good.
Timing is good and done in a respectful way.
Very respectfully. And it can't be sarcasm.
Right.
That's not really a good kind of humor. Empathy shifts anger and fear. So if you respond in an empathic way, you're going to calm the nervous system down of the person you're talking to. And then connecting to love and gratitude shifts fear, sadness, and anxiety. And then we also know that deep breathing calms anxiety unless a person is over what we would think of as a threshold of being so upset that they have to kind of calm the chemicals of upset down. So the goal of therapy is often modulating these states of arousal and triggering needed brain circuits. So we'd like you to think about this, and you're already using, when it's appropriate, humor, empathy, connecting to love and gratitude. We encourage you to add this deep breathing, but curiosity is such a powerful tool for repatterning, and also curiosity leads to helping people change their ideas of limitation. And in these experiences, like the warming of the hands, when that's another way of suggesting to people that they have more abilities than they think they do. Well,
So I wanted to talk about a situation. We have 3 children. They're all grown. They range from 47, 44, and 40. They're all very successful. At one time, when we were younger, they were a lot younger. So this was, I think, 1983.
wow.
And we were flying from Houston to Washington, D.C. to visit my parents, who were getting on in years, and spend Christmas with them. And we got to Washington, D.C., and when we got there, we realized that we forgot 3 Christmas presents. The kids were okay. They got on the airplane, and we got them all there, but 2 Christmas presents for 2 nieces and 1 Christmas present for a nephew never made it onto the plane. So we needed to go to a shopping mall, Springfield Shopping Mall in Northern Virginia. Well, when we got there, this was a time when we had a big cold snap throughout the United States. Houston got very cold. The Washington, D.C. area was much colder than Houston. So we had to take 3 kids about 4 days to Christmas to a shopping mall in freezing weather with about a 20-mile-an-hour wind. So it was not ideal situations to take kids into a shopping mall. My parents were aging at that time, and we needed to make sure that we didn't leave 3 young kids with them that they couldn't take care of. So we got into the shopping mall, and you're there just a few days before Christmas, about 3 days before Christmas. And Tiffany at this point was 4 years old. Yeah, she was 4 years old, 3 days before Christmas. You're in a shopping mall, the sights and the smells and the sounds of Christmas, toys, fun-looking candy, all sorts of things were just there wafting over their senses. And so we went through the mall and got a present for John and for Courtney and for Lindsay. So we're coming out and going back through JCPenney. Tiffany had a little pink parka. And it was important to get that parka on and zipped because, again, it was extremely cold and we had parked quite some ways from the store. Well, Tiffany thought it was quite inappropriate to buy other people Christmas presents and she wasn't getting a Christmas present. So, having been just overloaded with all the sights, the smells, and sounds of Christmas, Tiffany decided she was not going to put on a parka and was not going to leave. She began to stomp her foot. Tiffany had gotten caught on an idea, and the idea was very unpleasant. Now, when you're just 3 years old, a few days before Christmas, telling her it's going to be Christmas soon, you're going to get presents, did not register for Tiffany. And so she said, no, no, no. Now, the question in front of me is how to help Tiffany shift her state. The state was one of anger, one of being incensed. The thought was that this is unfair. So the unfairness and the state of anger were tied together, and she also was asserting her right to protest. Well, arguing with her did not change anything. So I watched Tiffany stomp her leg. I said, Tiffany, this is remarkable. You're stomping your right leg very loudly. How come you're not stomping your left leg? He says, I am stomping my left leg. I said, Tiffany, you can't be. I had a college ring on at that time, and I held out my right hand, and I reached over to Tiffany's left leg and said, this is my right hand, yes? And I touched her left leg and said, that must be your right leg. Tiffany thought for a moment. I said, no, Daddy, you're backwards. This is my left leg. I said, Tiffany, you're right, that is your left, and you've been stomping your left leg very, very loudly, but you're not stomping your right leg. Is there something inexorably wrong with stomping your right leg that you just choose your left leg? And I thought it was the right leg, and it was the right leg to stomp, even though the right leg was the left leg that was left out. And Tiffany looked, and she started stomping her right leg. Very, very loudly. I said, Tiffany, this is remarkable. You stomped your right leg, which I thought was the left leg, and was the leg left out, as loudly as you stomped your left leg, which I thought was the right leg, and was the right leg to stomp, until you started stomping the right leg, which now wasn't left out. Isn't that right? Is there any reason that you only stomp them one at a time? Tiffany thought for a moment. She began to bounce and hop up and down. I said, Tiffany, this is remarkable. You stomped your left leg, which I thought was the right leg, and was the right leg to stomp, as loudly as you stomped your right leg, which was the one that was left out, and I thought was the left leg, but actually was the right leg, and you stomped them both as loudly as you stomped each one of them. Isn't that right? Is there some reason that you're only stomping, and the linoleum had squares, is there something wrong with that? Square. That square. That square. And that square. And what Tiffany and I did, then we began to do right leg, left leg, hop, right leg, left leg, hop, and she and I did the bunny hop all the way out of JCPenney, and that time I managed to get her parka zipped up and her parka hood tied.
And by now we had gathered a crowd of parents that were sort of in awe and in a state of learning, I think. And as we all exited the door, they clapped for us.
So, what did I do? Well, one, I did not get caught in a sense of, oh my, we've got to do this right away. Or defining the problem with Tiffany's misbehaving. Now, her behavior was, as a young child, only 4 years old, she was caught on a thought, caught on a feeling. My job was to figure out a way to help distract her, using play, using some mild confusion, right, left patterning, and make a game out of it. So what happened in getting this sense of confusion, especially being able to correct Daddy, because this is my right hand, that's your right leg, no, you're backwards. So using some confusion, laughter and play, and really in a subtle way inviting her to play along in this game, it moved her away from a thought that at this point was not particularly useful to her, and had we got into a confrontation, would have been more problematic, more painful emotionally, if not physically painful. So that's an example of how to create a chaining state. an alternate mid-range state. So confusion, play, to one of cooperation. She was able to get there and did not stay stuck on that thought.
And it's also a wonderful example of the ability we have to change states, to let go of struggling in a situation and to step into a new possibility. Yeah. So we have these uncommon abilities, and you know, we think we're wired to be extraordinary, right?
Yes.
We really are. So we'd like you to say about yourself, to yourself, you are extraordinary, because it's true.
You are extraordinary.
You're extraordinary. Well, what are the brain superpowers? We're going to talk about 7 of them, and there are probably many more. But these are the ones we want to talk about in this course. And the first one is rapid state change, and that was pretty rapid with Tiffany.
Yes. And again, to pay attention how it's possible to move from one profound state.
Yes.
She was angry,
Right.
irritated with the thinking that went along with it. This is unfair. This isn't right. To, in just a few minutes, let that go of that.
Right.
And to use curiosity and play to kind of unsettle that, and then to move to a cooperative state.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And so we can make these changes pretty quickly, where worry, rumination, anger, anxiety, depression dissolve. And we want to suggest this to you that you know, we've had some of our students say, "Oh well, that just in the moment, it doesn't last." Well, the first thing we're interested in doing is interrupting the pattern, and then trying to find a target state, or a state that's closer to a target state that people can begin to move into, so that things start to shift, and so that they don't stay wedded to this particular state and reality they're in. So a second superpower is what we call brain-heart coherence. You may be familiar with HeartMath, heartmath.org. They've developed some really nice, simple biofeedback tools where you can work on getting your heart and your brain to be sort of in a very wonderful state of cooperation, just by imagining breathing through your heart and thinking about someone you love. And this completely shifts your ranges of dominant brain frequencies. So we'll talk more about that later. You can balance your blood flow with different bilateral stimulations so that you're more in a state of coherence. We would call this, really, from a psychological point of view, the state of psychological coherence. And we'll be talking about tossing the ball in just a moment. EMDR, of course, is a wonderful
It's a bilateral stimulation.
bilateral stimulation, that's right. And then, of course, a third superpower is your ability to create a state of bliss. You are able to develop blissed brain. And it's wonderful to be able to move into the state, because as you move into a state of bliss, you begin to experience more elevated states of joy, hopefulness, sometimes ecstasis that is called. And of course, this is all after your brain has released its own marijuana. We'll be talking about that very specifically later. And we know that another superpower is that we can turn on and off brain circuits. We can turn off brain circuits that stimulate the past, and turn on circuits that activate the best future.
And there we're calming the amygdala by doing things such as walking in nature, spending time with friends, seeing a movie, or talking with a therapist.
And a fifth superpower is that we can move into what's called a state of flow. We can access states of optimism and serenity through this flow in rituals of wellness. We can stimulate flow in a variety of ways, and some of those include doing things that just engage your attention. We'll talk more at length about this in another module. But using certain nutritional foods or using self-enhancing tools, like a tool we've used for years is a little audio-visual entrainment device called the David Delight from a Canadian company called Mind Alive. We don't make money off of that, by the way. And a sixth superpower is the ability to enhance mental wellness by desensitizing your autonomic nervous system. So, you can think about a time you felt empowered, but what we know is that when you desensitize your autonomic nervous system, that is, you're going to activate your parasympathetic system, and you call up a negative memory, every time you review the memory and you're in a calmer state, the way the brain works is it recodes that memory into long-term memory rather than keeping it into short-term memory, and it changes it. It recodes it, and so that you will not have a charge connected to it when it's done correctly. And then the seventh superpower is what we call the ability for embodied knowledge. This is very fascinating to me. It's the intuitive knowing that's picked up by the body. We'd like to talk about this superpower a little bit more in this module. So what is embodied knowledge? It refers to these capacities that you have, like amazing intuitions, insight, and it actually, you really can feel it in your body. So, sometimes people use the phrase, I can't stomach that. If you listen to how we use certain phrases like that, we're using the body as an indicator of what is the right thing for you to do or not to do. So it's kind of like your inner guidance system. You can tune into your body, by the way, and get a yes or no about decisions. So we'd like you to think about if you have a decision right now that you're kind of struggling with, and hold the idea of yes, you want to do X, or you want to do Y. Notice how you might feel a certain pressure in your body in one direction or the other. This is your intuitive capacity. It's curious, interesting, that indigenous people use this honed sense they called extending their inner vision to know what was in front of them and in back of them that they couldn't see with their eyes. And we can actually train this body sense to pick up information. So this ability to sense the right path or make the right decision could be thought of as this guiding strength in the center of our being. And we really encourage you to start getting in touch with this. It's expressed in a lot of different forms, like feeling connected, moments of clarity, somehow this feeling that you don't understand about persevering about something, sense of aliveness or flow. Sometimes it's the way it's experienced. So how do you get in touch with this? While taking a walk, imagine your field of energy around the body, and by the way, we all have that. Field of energy expands in all directions, and experiment with sensing what's ahead of you, even though you can't see it, and what's behind you. And you may notice that you're going to pick up a presence. It could be a little animal, it could be a person. It's very fascinating to work with this. So Bill and I have done a lot of meditation training, and we have, all of us have what we call this process of mind. So you start with a kind of sensation. It could be a pressure, it could be a tickle, it could be something. You give it a label, you name it, as I just did, but then it's usually followed by a judgment, either it's bad or it's good. And then, guess what? Then you're in a mental state. But you don't stop there, because then you tell a story about it. And very frequently the story has to do with one of your most favorite Stephen King horror movies of the mind, and we all have them. So we want to just suggest to you to watch for this. And speaking of that Stephen King horror movie of the mind, we have this default network in the brain where if you think about something bad that happened to you, your mind is immediately going to go to the worst possible future, that not only will that bad thing that happened to you get repeated, but it'll be 10 times as bad.
We were teaching in Lansing, Michigan, a couple years ago, and we got to Lansing, which is a nice town. It's the state capital of Michigan, and East Lansing, which is the east part of the city, is from Michigan State University. As we have friends that went to Michigan State. We got there and we parked in pretty much an empty parking lot. We were at a particular part of the hotel. Now, one of Carol's least favorite movies from Stephen King is The Shining.
Oh, yeah.
And you have a beautiful hotel. I think it's the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park. Estes Park is one of Carol's most favorite towns, and we've been there a number of times. But she does not like The Shining, especially when two things come up. One is when Jack Nicholson takes an axe and breaks the door and very loudly says, "Here's Johnny." Now, we both like Johnny Carson. We used to watch him when he was on late night television. But that phrase was one that Carol really did not like. The other is throughout the movie, the little boy keeps looking at the word murder backwards and goes, "Red rum, red rum." So we come into the part of the hotel, it's where the conference center is. There was nobody there.
Not a soul.
Not a soul. And we kept walking, and Carol was getting a little bit anxious, and this is how you change states. When your somewhat daffy husband starts walking around with you going, "Red rum, red rum, red rum." What that did was take the situation and make it playful. We did find somebody all the way around on the other side of the hotel that checked us in, but there weren't many people there. In fact, when we had dinner that night, we asked them to make a salad, and we wanted a Caesar salad, and they used kale. Have you ever had Caesar salad made with kale? It's not the right thing. And Carol said, "Can you have? Can I make me margarita?" And the gal said, "I can look it up." Well, this is going to be an interesting experience. So anyway, the hotel was nice, the people were nice, and the people in the workshop were quite wonderful.
Right.
But when you walk through something that looks like your favorite hotel and the worst favorite movie that you've ever had, and your husband went, "Red rum, red rum." Then there was this sense of playfulness.
Then it totally changed my state.
changed
It
your
was
state.
terrific. Yeah. So this default mode network governs how we obsess about things, and where we all actually tend to be really good at imagining the worst possible future, and so that's something we have to interrupt all the time, because we become very expert about doing the things that we practice,
Right.
whether they're feelings or behaviors.
And at one time in history, or other times, it actually may enhance our ability to survive. So if we're running around in hunter-gatherer tribes, and you remember seeing one of your friends eaten by whatever it was you were hunting and going to make dinner out of, you're going to remember that. You're going to remember the worst scenario, the worst stomach ache that you ever had, as opposed to the most wonderful meal. A tragedy, you're going to remember much more than wonderful situations. Well, the brain is what has we call negative bias, and it keeps us alive. The problem is that when we get out of situations that are really threatening, those chemicals tend to stay with us, and we then tend to go over and over and over, even when the situation has changed. And so we've not evolved enough that what we do is are able to just naturally get those chemicals out of the brain. We tend to keep them, stay focused, and then that begins to kind of chip away, erode the quality of our lives. So we're designed to survive moment by moment by moment. Quality of life is something secondary. We live in a world, well, for most of us, not everybody, for certain, most of us move from situations of somewhat danger. The dangers are different. Dangers of being fired, not getting a promotion, whatever. Sometimes there are things that jump at us and they're physically dangerous. But what we want to do is to be able to change these default modes, default networks, so that when we're not in a dangerous situation, we recognize the difference. There are two learning theories here. One is stimulus generalization, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. When you're in a dangerous situation, the brain's going to look for anything that reminds it anywhere near that. The other is stimulus discrimination. And that is something that's slower to develop, but that's so we learn that the situation is different and we don't need to be on high alert. And so we don't need to have the quality of our lives or develop high blood pressure or all sorts of problems when we're in a state of hyperarousal too long.
Well, so we'd like you to think about what is your favorite horror movie of the mind? What is your favorite Stephen King movie? What's the first scene and what's the ending scene? I know people will be able to come up with it like that. Usually clients ruminate on the last scene when things are the worst. And then they get kind of stuck going over and over that. So we talk about this as getting control of the fuzzed factor, just to be playful. Fear, uncertainty, and self-doubt, the fuzzed factor. So how fuzzed are you? So you can gently question your fuzzed thinking. Is that really true? Is that future going to happen? But for most of us, that doesn't help that much because we can say it certainly is. And, it happened in the past, it's going to happen in the future. So the idea here is rather than doing this cognitive change, is that we go in and we shift our state rather than reviewing the worst possible future.
And again, with Sullenberger, he was able to practice deliberate calm, and it actually made him much more effective in landing an airplane. He never practiced in landing in water, but in some ways, the landing is the same. The nose is the last thing to come down. And so he landed like this, and if you've seen this on the news clips, it was a perfect landing. So when you get through the fuzzed issues and you practice calm, you practice a state that in most cases is going to make you more aware and to act more appropriately. You don't want to be erratic when you're flying an airplane. You don't want to end up in the worst case scenario, I'm going to crash. Crashing is the last thing you want to have on your mind, and you land the airplane beautifully in the water.
That's right. So again, you can overcome this fuzzed event by your empathic curiosity. So one of the things you can do is ask yourself, do you have any backstories? We call that backstories for past events that might have happened to you that contributed to developing life themes for you. These will show up in your present relationships. If you have more than a subjective unit of disturbance of 5 in, let's say, a relationship difficulty or a difficulty you're having making a decision, there's probably what we call backstory there that may be contributing. That's something that happened a long time ago and some learning you had. For example, what did your parents often say about you? What were you teased about? When did you feel left out of a group? When did you not feel taken seriously? And maybe that'll stimulate some memories of what happened.
So these backstories often show up when you've been abused or teased as a child. You end up not confronting somebody who hurts you. You may just move away, or you may let people overrun you, and you become aggressive and overreact to the situation.
Usually you're going to have specific triggers, so you can overreact emotionally. Maybe you get depressed or get into despair.
So, give you an example of how one of these things turned out and did not turn out very well. If you remember Pavlov and Pavlov's dog, in classical conditioning, Pavlov took 2 stimuli and conditioned them together to have a very interesting result. So he had the dog and smelling meat powder. And as the dog smelled the meat powder, the dog would salivate. And he conditioned that response as a conditioned response. Then he added a bell, and the bell was a non-conditioned response. He paired these together so he would have the dog smell the meat powder, salivate at the same time he rang the bell. Eventually, he conditioned a non-conditioned response or stimuli had the same response. That when he rang the bell but didn't use the meat powder, the dog would salivate. Well, we're not talking about abusing dogs, so that didn't happen. What they did was they did a piece of research that today cannot be done. But it is a piece of research which can show you how a backstory can begin to develop itself forward. So they used a little boy, his name was Albert, and what they did was they set him down on the floor. Little Albert was old enough that he could walk and toddle around, but not very old. And they would bang pots and pans, make loud noises, and they would frighten and scare little Albert. Well, small children and loud noises, they want safety. At the same time, they ran a little bunny rabbit in front. You have the conditioned response, which is the banging of the pots and pans and the crying, and non-conditioned stimuli, which is the bunny rabbit, has nothing to do
With the white
with the
rabbit.
white rabbit.
Yeah.
White rabbit, yeah. And has nothing to do with the loud noises. But they got paired in classical conditioning. And so the little Albert would eventually start to cry when he saw the white bunny rabbit right across his visual screen. Well, it didn't end with that. Again, I mentioned a little while ago, we have another learning theory of stimulus generalization. Again, the brain, when there's danger or trauma, take a look at the stimuli, in this case something white and furry, and begin to look at all sorts of other white furry things, lest they also be dangerous. And the Albert was too young to think, wait a minute, pots and pans these jerks were making, that's the issue, not the bunny rabbit. He was too little for this. And so, little Albert said his grandfather or his uncle had a nice white beard. Well, that white beard began to set off the same response in little Albert. Now, what needed to happen was stimulus discrimination. So little Albert realized that the white beard was different from the bunny rabbit, and the bunny rabbit had nothing to do with the pots and pans and the loud noise and crying. That would be a rather sophisticated unraveling. Well, that didn't happen. Now, years and years ago, when we first started taking psych classes, we were told that they actually reworked this for little Albert and had a happy ending. Later on, we realized it didn't. They never did anything to unwind the learning. And what happened then is the little Albert only lived to be 6 years old. Again, another mind-body reality is that people are in a state of hyperarousal, especially if it starts young. Hyperarousal and fear and panic and grief, crying, it messed with little Albert's immune system. And
Well, and actually it affected his brain to
Yes.
the extent that he developed hydrocephalus.
Hydrocephalus.
Thank you. And it was because he lived after that experience, he could never get his autonomic nervous system to calm down.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, he died at age 6, which was tragic.
so again, you have a classical condition situation. The stimulus generalization, over-arousal, the inability to calm down the nervous system. And again, had they unwanted, they would have had to have gone back and given a lot of comforting to Albert so that he could look at the situation from afar. We talk about distance and visual systems, and that would have been helpful to him, but that didn't happen. So, but that is an example of how all of us learn, and just doing insight may not be enough to calm, at this point, the autonomic nervous system
Yeah.
down so that he's able to receive or experience comfort.
So this has a lot to do with the backstories that we all carry, and it's important to begin to recognize, have your clients recognize what level of charge they still have connected to things that happen to them. And because it's the charge that's still in the body that can cause immune problems and all kinds of things as we live our lives as adults, including life patterns or themes that lead to beliefs that have developed certain thinking, feelings, and behaving. Now, we've given you this kind of interesting optical illusion just because it represents how beliefs keep us bound to a certain reality. And in Will Albert's condition, state, he was traumatized in a really bad way for a research project. And he ended up just being anxious all the time. So these cubes are actually not moving. But because the light is flashing, it looks like they're rotating. And how many times do we have this sort of thing happen to us where things have happened and we develop a belief about it, and this is the kind of reality we see, but it's not accurate. And so unless we can kind of get hold of what those backstories are and get the charge released, and there are a variety of ways to do that, like with bilateral stimulation we'll be talking about.
As well as the therapeutic relationship.
Yes.
That, again, it's not just developing insight about what happened, it's developing an understanding of that, a picture of that story in a way that's from a calm state. And again, in behavioral terms, systematic desensitization is something that we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So we can look at something from a distance, it becomes closer and closer and closer, become desensitized to the original stimuli.
Right.
And then the charge is gone. And when that charge is gone, we then can develop another story, a more functional story. Had Albert been able to live, he would have been able to realize, well, these are researchers that were acting irresponsibly, and they frightened me, and the rabbit has nothing to do with it. It had everything to do with these people. The pots and pans are not necessarily dangerous, and it has to do with from a position of safety. Look at something
Right.
in a different way, from a different emotional state.
Now, we've given you an assessment that Bill and I developed, and it has to do with finding out about the backstories of your clients. You can go over this yourself, but there are different levels of assessment that we've done over the years. So what are the interpersonal dynamics, interpersonal backstories, intrapersonal, physiological elements that can lead us to a hypothesis about what's happening, and then for us to think about what are the needed resources that this individual needs to overcome this particular situation. And in addition, we always assess for brain injury. In fact, we always ask people 5 times, have you ever hit your head? Have you ever hit your head? And most people say, no, no, no. Oh, well, there was that one time. And I just want to tell you briefly about a case. A young man came to me, actually his parents brought him to me, and the parents said, we can't get him to go to school. He was in high school, and have him stay. He always calls about 10 o'clock, and he wants to come home, and he says he's throwing up. Well, the first thing they thought about was that he was just not wanting to go to class. And I asked him in the session if he was having trouble did he not like school? Did he just not want to go? And he said, no, I like it. He said, I just, for some reason, am always getting nauseous, and I feel like I need to come home. And so this was getting to be very, very difficult. Parents were fighting with him, and he felt terrible about himself and so forth. And so I asked this question, have you ever hit your head? And the young man said, oh, no. And the mom said in the session, oh, yes, you did. Don't you remember? You were playing with boys, and y'all were fighting playfully, and you slipped, and you fell into a swimming pool without water, and you hit the back of your head. And I said, how long was it after that event that you started having these symptoms? And Mom said, oh, it was about 3 weeks. And I said, you know, it sounds to me like there may have been a brain injury from this. And let me recommend to you that we do EEGs in our office that are looked at by our consulting neurologist. And so they agreed to that. We gave him an EEG. Sure enough, as we ran that through what's called a traumatic brain index, it showed up that there was indeed a brain injury. And actually, he was having a little seizure activity. And so we did, instead of psychotherapy, we did neurofeedback for a number of sessions until he was able to get over the nausea, and he returned to school. He actually ended up going to the university and graduating and later becoming a professional person.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going through physical therapy a while back, and I'm sitting in the waiting room waiting for my time to come, and this woman comes up to me and says, I know you. I looked at her and said, what are you referring to? She says, you Dr. Kershaw's husband? I said, yes. And she repeated the story, and by this time, her son had developed enough brain stability that he had gone through college, became a lawyer, and her husband came up also, and this had made a profound impact on them. Tremendous impact. They were just extremely grateful for what you had done, and here was somebody that would have been easy to say he's just refusing, there's some psychological issue, or he's just acting out his desire for independence, and none of that was the case. It was a traumatic brain injury, and hitting the back of his head. The brain map of the EEG showed that electroform activity, which is a seizure activity, and we were able to treat that through EEG biofeedback or neurofeedback, and he was able to then go on and have successful adolescence and successful academic career.
And so it's so important that we can figure out in our assessment, what it is we need to treat. So we've given you a picture in your PowerPoint. This is a slide of a person who's having a panic attack. And actually, so what's happening is there's not enough blood in one hemisphere and over amount in the other. And this is also a picture of what epileptiform activity, it's a little seizure activity. It's not epilepsy, but if sometimes with head injury, there can be misfiring or slight seizure activity that can result in physical symptoms and mood swings. Nausea is one of them. So we want to find out again what these backstories are that really relate to our core issues, and there can be global issues that a person is having to experience, no matter whether it's in career. It seems to crisscross all levels of activity and focus. And so we'd like you to consider that this is something very important in terms of how you make an assessment. Well, we appreciate you being here throughout this module 2, and next module we're going to talk about something very interesting, and that is how you kind of can see with the back of your head, so to speak. I'm kidding, but your visual system is quite important in how you create problems unintentionally and how you solve them. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you in module 3.